your speech offends me, therefore it's hateful, therefore you can't say it. We need a speech code. International student money is now, it's like half the income for a number of universities here, partly because the domestic home student fees have been frozen for many years. And so the universities are incredibly reliant on this overseas student income. They get to charge much higher fees. And that's really what drives the system.
Even if we fix the university, which I hope we will do, will we actually fix the culture, or has this sort of jumped the lab in a way that it's no longer even fixable by reforming the university?
The rise of social media means it's easier to organize a flash mob. You can press the like button. You don't actually have to show up anywhere. It just makes it that much easier to have these cancel culture mobs, to have open letters because of the internet.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hello, and welcome to The Contrarian. I'm your host, David Bernstein, and with us today is Eric Kaufmann. Eric is really one of the primary observers of the academic world and has done some of the most important survey work. And I'm so glad to have you on. I couldn't imagine doing a series on the state of the academy without actually checking in with you and getting your sense of things. So thanks so much, Eric.
Thanks, David. It's great to be on. Thanks for having me. This is something that I've looked at a lot.
Yeah. So why don't we start there? There's a lot of questions I have for you, but why don't we start with this sort of state of heterodoxy in the academy? I had Steven Pinker on our inaugural podcast, and he said that at Harvard, only 3% of the faculty were conservative, which, I think is probably lower than it was years ago. But you've really looked at this in the US, the UK, and other places. What are you seeing in the data?
Well, just by the way, to say, people say, academia has always been left. In the 1940s, they did, I think the Crimson did a survey and asked Harvard staff whether communists should be allowed to teach at Harvard. And overwhelmingly, they were against. The things have changed. But what are the patterns in the data? Roughly speaking, you heard that statistic at Harvard. It's something like 98% donate to Democrats. Now, obviously, people who are politically active and donating are not the majority. So let's look at broadly research universities. It's something like 9-1 in Britain anyway. And the social sciences did a survey, and we basically took a very kind of random type of sample. And I can explain that if you want later. But we got about 9-1 in the social sciences, left to right. The surveys in the U.S. based on party registration data, it's something like 12 or 13-1 in those same fields. The surveys I did in the U.S., which were opt-in, but I had like several thousand, it was like 14-1. So those are the kind of numbers we're talking about in terms of left to right. Now, as we move into those soft social sciences, anthropology, sociology, as opposed to economics and even to some degree politics, those are more moderate, but the softer the social sciences, and of course all of the grievance studies disciplines, race, gender, et cetera, it's going to, essentially you don't find conservatives, or it's like 100-1, something ridiculous. Humanities, similar, many of the humanities. So that's kind of the ideological picture. So I was interested in that, but then the other numbers are, for example, would you discriminate against a known Trump supporter in the US or Brexit supporter in Britain? Using a kind of concealed list method, which kind of gets at the people who don't necessarily want to admit that they would, but they would. That was, so we had about a third of British academics who were revealed that they wouldn't hire a known Brexit supporter. Brexit passed like 52-48 in the country. And in the US, it was like 40% wouldn't hire a known Trump supporter. So that kind of gives you the levels of overt political discrimination that are going on. Now, there's other things I can talk about: self-censorship, hostile environment perceptions by people who don't share the majority left view. So roughly that number is around 70 to 75% in the U.S. In Britain, it's maybe between 50 and 70% of conservatives who say they self-censor in research, teaching, and discussion. So we're getting a a real suppression of academic freedom. A lot of it's through these peer mechanisms.
Explain that peer mechanism a bit.
Well, yeah, so a lot of the attention on cancel culture is with administrators in universities firing staff after being pressured by cancel culture mobs or activists. And so that's an institutional punishment for speech. What I think is actually the bigger deal, I mean, I think that is a big deal. Now, there are more legal and political mechanisms to deal with that. But the bigger deal, I think, is not so much people getting fired as not getting hired, promoted, published, given a grant. And that's because their colleagues who are judging them in journals and they're judging them on grant applications and on promotion applications are discriminating against those who don't have the right views. And so that's another powerful incentive to muzzle yourself. So even if you are willing to take a chance because you think you're going to be protected from firing from your administration, you're not going to take a chance if you think your colleagues are going to kibosh your career or even socially ostracize you, because that makes everyday life unpleasant.
Right. So I'm sure you've spent a lot of time in the US, Canada, the UK. How would you compare the ideological environments in those three places? You're saying that there's problems in the UK and you cited data in the United States. Can you feel, apart from whatever the data says, do you sense that the UK is less problematic than the US and Canada?
I think it is slightly less, but it's not much less. And so there's a lot of platforming here, particularly of gender critical feminists, people who oppose the transgender activist agenda. There have been, I've been targeted a whole bunch of times, internal investigations, Twitter mobbings, open letters, all of that. So that all goes on here. I mean, I think you might say things are just that little bit worse in the U.S. It depends on the survey. Some surveys don't show a difference. Others show somewhat of a difference. I think it's marginally less bad in Britain. Canada, my view is it's the same as in the blue states, which means that overall it's worse because there's no counterweight there. I think Canada's in the most dire situation. Probably Australia and New Zealand are in a similar boat. Canada, there really isn't a counterweight.
Yes, that's what I always tell people. Right. There's no political force coming in the opposite direction that's preventing this from spreading anywhere in Canada. It's like wildfire.
Yeah, exactly. And they've got all the craziness of the woke left, and they've got almost no real resistance from the other side. Now, slowly, some of the conservative provinces with conservative premiers are beginning to dip their toe in the water on the gender issue and the informing parents of pronoun changes. That's just started in the last year. Mm-hmm. It'll be interesting to see where that goes, but it's nowhere near as advanced as what's happening in the red states, for example, with bans on DEI, critical race theory in schools and all of that. So there isn't the same counterweight, and I just think the academics they're just quite beleaguered. All they can do is just cluster together for mutual support, try to write op-eds. And the press is also relatively unbalanced. Now, that's true in the U.S. to some degree in the print side, but on the electronic side, there's Fox News, and then there's nothing like that in Canada. So much harder for them to get their voice out. Yeah.
Are there DEI statements in the UK or anything equivalent to a DEI statement in the UK as we've seen in the US?
I'm not aware of it. It does exist to some extent. I'm not aware of the numbers on this. I mean, so in Canada, it's rife. I'm sure it's coming. There are a whole bunch of debate areas. So Britain's been under a conservative government for 14 years, they haven't been great, but they have put some restraints, and they've got a higher education free speech bill, which I worked on that actually to some degree, or was one of the people who was involved in inputting into that. And what that says is basically it prevents universities from no platforming or engaging in firing for speech. So it's actually universities have a duty to protect and to promote academic freedom. There's a complaints procedure. There's a statutory torts procedure now. You can sue your university. That legislation, I think, is already having an effect on universities and student unions being able to kind of no platform and cancel. So that's been a positive, but I still think a lot of the same dynamics in terms of the big skew leading to political discrimination, leading to self-censorship, that's all happening. So I would say it's marginally better, but not hugely better.
How about DEI bureaucracies in British universities?
Well, there I think it is better here because universities are quite poor. I mean, the honest answer is even the relatively prestigious ones have almost no endowment. The amount that they're allowed to charge students has been fixed for a long time, and so that the fees have dropped 25% in real terms. So yeah, they are much lighter on bureaucracy. They can't do a University of Michigan and hire
right.
So
300 staff people.
Yeah. So that's not really, I don't think it's a big factor behind it here. It's just radical staff and students plus their Twitter networks pressuring compliant, sometimes somewhat sympathetic, top level administration. But it doesn't strike me that that's the big driving force the way it is in the U.S.
Yeah, I just heard this astounding figure yesterday that at Yale, they spend $200,000 per student per year to educate them. If you just take the overall budget of the university and divide it by the number of students, that's a crazy figure, and it just tells you how sprawling the bureaucracies are in some of these universities. And of course, it's not all in DEI, but a high percentage of it in DEI. It's sort of inexplicable to me. I mean, do you have a sense of why these universities have expanded their bureaucratic infrastructure so much?
Well, yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, one is the rich universities, they're not profit-making entities, so they can't sort of give profits to shareholders. So they're just accumulating this money from donors and from students. So the question is, what do you do with that money? I mean, the logical thing, if you don't save it and you're going to spend it, you could, spruce up the grounds, or you could just pad out every department with all these jobs for your friends or and so I think part of it is just that's one place money can go. Buildings is another place money can go, grounds. So I just think it's partly because they've got money and they can't declare profits. Now, of course, the other part of this is there has been this DEI ideology, which is kind of metastasized. And, every time students protest or staff protest in shame, they're pushing for more and more positions. And so that's how these positions are created, almost as a sort of way of kind of getting the activists off their backs.
Right.
So, yeah, I think it's just grown over time, and this becomes an interest group like any other.
Right. So there's a lot of talk in the U.S. right now about the role of foreign money, particularly that from Qatar. And I saw some figures which suggest that there's actually more Qatari money entering the UK system than there is in the U.S. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of that. I mean, I've always felt that this is largely a homegrown phenomenon, but that doesn't mean that there isn't foreign influence here as well. What is your sense of that?
Well, that has kind of come into the news and with Chinese money as well.
Yes.
This whole question of whether, can you fail? These students expect to be passed. Number one, they don't want to hear criticisms of regimes that they're loyal to. Number two, there's threats perhaps to withdraw funding. And also the other issue is, of course, that, international student money is now, it's like half the income for a number of universities here, partly because the domestic home student fees have been frozen for many years. And so the universities are incredibly reliant on this overseas student income. They get to charge much higher fees. And that's really what drives the system. So they're very dependent on it, which means they can be blackmailed in a way. And I think that we had a case here of an academic who was essentially disciplined, was disciplined for criticizing the Chinese regime. And so you'll get those stories that will come up. It became a major free speech sensation. Like her free speech, she said something critical, she was let go. And that became a story. So I think these kinds of stories may become more common. It's definitely viewed as a problem.
Yeah. It's interesting. I read a piece, I think it was in Tablet Magazine a couple of weeks ago, about how foreign students are driving a lot of the radicalism we're seeing on campuses, particularly students from the Arab world. And the universities, want them because they pay higher fees. but B, because they also meet their DEI targets using, with students from, the Arab world or Qatar or United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia or whatever. And it seems to me that that's probably a significant factor. I mean, we talk a lot about the Red-Green Alliance, this alliance between sort of radical Islam and radical progressive politics. And I think you're seeing that, I think it's been around in Europe for actually several decades, but you're seeing it really take shape in the United States on campuses. And it's probably being driven by this large number of students from the Arab world.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that that's a contributing factor. I mean, you've also got significant, at least in this country, last census had it at 6.5% Muslims. So you have a significant UK-born Muslim student population as well. They attend above average as well. So in certain universities, I mean, I used to teach at a London university. Across the street was this place called the School of Oriental and African Studies. That was kind of like a hotbed for this kind of red-green type politics and that kind of radicalism that sees a third world type ally. And so, yeah, the foreign students are on, I don't have the data, but I wouldn't be surprised if they are bulking up the numbers just by virtue of the fact that there's a larger pool. And as I said, the universities, the ethos is very kind of pro-international student, not just because it's how their bread is buttered, but I think it's generally seen as, this diversifies things. And so there's always kind of been a favorable view towards that diversity. And so, yeah, I think it's a contributing factor, although I still think that if the dominant kind of white leftist ideology was opposed, for example, on the trans issue or on any LGBT issue, then I think that these things wouldn't take off the way they have. It's the fact that they mesh so well with that kind of woke, the ideology that says there's oppressor and oppressed, and it's the colonized against the colonizers, the settlers, that kind of view. That's the dominant ideological view. And so, of course, that's going to fit like a glove.
How do you describe the ideological shift that's taken place? I've talked to a number of people about this, and of course, there's some compelling texts about it, but what's your version of what's happened?
Well, I mean, it's funny because I was just reading, and I'll show this, and I don't know, obviously for those who are online, but or those who are just listening won't see this, but this is a book called Debating PC. It's from 1992. I was just having a read through there, and it was almost everything in there was exactly the same as what's happening now. It was battles over Eurocentric curriculum. It was battles over sensitivity to minority groups and what you can and can't say, and it's hate speech. And actually, we are really those ideas, all the ideas on the cultural left were already pretty much there, except for trans. Everything was pretty much there in the early 1990s. It's just that the scale of everything is so much greater. All the diversity bureaucrats, and the language is a little different. It's now, instead of sensitivity, it's microaggressions and emotional trauma and emotional safety. But it's basically the same idea. Your speech offends me, therefore it's hateful, therefore you can't say it. We need a speech code. And then on the sort of equality, multicultural side, it's, white male equals bad, dead white male equals bad, and diverse female LGBT equals good. It's just the same basic idea structure. So I don't think that's changed. Now, of course, we have seen the rise of social media, and the rise of social media means it's easier to organize a flash mob. You can press the like button. You don't actually have to show up anywhere. It just makes it that much easier to have these cancel culture mobs, to have open letters, because of the internet, which wasn't around in the early 90s. And so I'd say it's more of a quantification, quantified scaling up rather than a qualitative change in this ideology. And what is this ideology? It's basically about taking the idea of equal outcomes instead of by class, as in Marxism, it's by identity group, so no race gap, no gender gap, etc. Then the other part of it is sort of what Jonathan Haidt would call the care harm foundation. So you can't hurt. That might mean psychologically hurt anybody who is seen as oppressed, and so that could be through speech. Therefore, we need to suppress your speech. And I guess the way we think of it now, sometimes, if you think of the diversity equity is the equality part, equal outcomes, and then the inclusion part is the harm, preventing harm. So that's all. The ideology, I think, is fundamentally the same. The only difference, I've got a book coming out on this in mid-May called The Third Awakening, and my argument is really that, yes, cultural Marxism was a factor, Marcuse and Angela Davis and all the things Chris Rufo talks about, in terms of the ideas, but I would argue that left liberalism has a bigger part to play in this. This idea of hypersensitivity to people feeling hurt feelings, and that certain groups have these traumas, and that we've just got to be so super nice and kind, and we've got to feel really guilty. And that kind of approach, which is very common in left liberalism, really helps to enable the most radical ideas to be accepted within the academy.
Do you think that came from a different place, a different political, social source than the oppressor binary? You think that emerged from some other cultural force?
Well, okay, so we've got the sort of, from Marxism, that oppressor-oppressed view of the world, the very power-centric view of the world. But then you have this thing called liberalism. And I don't mean John Stuart Mill classical liberalism,
right,
as the principle. I mean the identity of being a liberal. You're not a Marxist. You reject command and control economics. But culturally, what do liberals stand for? And one of the points is that in the 20th century, what liberalism has very much been about, liberalism embodies a certain amount of equality because you want equal rights for African Americans, for women, and I think those are all things we would support. But a lot of the myths and memories and symbols, emotions behind liberalism are about equality and fights for equality and fights for the weak against the strong, but also it's minorities against the majority. And so you get this, I would call it an emotional gut reflex, which is majorities are threatening and scary, and minorities are cuddly. We want to romanticize them, and they're the good guys. And even though I reject Marxism, I have this very simple emotional response to majorities and minorities. And that, I think, colors everything that liberals have pursued. And for a while, that was to the good. Once we reached past the mid-'60s, I think some of the negativity of this is coming out in terms of racial preferences, which means discrimination against whites and now Asians. And also this hypersensitivity to hurt feelings amongst groups who are constructed as completely fragile and can't take any criticism. So therefore, we got to muzzle anybody who says anything that might be interpreted by the most sensitive individual. And so it's got to be, Latinx, not Latino. It's got to be, it starts out as Black and then it's African American. And then, so I just think there's this dynamic, because if the liberals didn't accept these ideas, then I think they would have gotten nowhere. They would have kept them out or kept them on the fringe of the academy. But because the liberals essentially were very susceptible to what the cultural Marxists were selling, they said, well, okay, maybe they've gone a bit too far, but their heart's in the right place. And okay. And they're very romantic. So we want them we want Angela Davis in our Eldridge Cleaver. Their hearts are in the right place. And so I think there's this enabling structure that liberalism provides.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm 57 years old, and in my own view, I as someone who has been sort of a political liberal, but center left liberal, it still seems there was a huge departure in that sentiment. That sentiment, the bleeding heart, always existed, but that something changed in the culture that empowered it, that gave it fuel. I feel like collectively we've sort of leaned into our anxiety somehow. And maybe there was a sort of a therapeutic culture that set in as well. Abigail Schreier has a book on this, on sort of called Bad Therapy. And I think some of John Haidt's work and, the change in parenting styles and the others that seem to me distinct, but perhaps related social phenomena to what you're describing as something sort of inbred into liberalism, into the bleeding heart. But it's an interesting, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, no, but it's interesting just going back to this Debating PC book in the early 90s, the differences are that back then the students were not, for the most part, were not as woke as the students now. And also this was very much confined to the campus, because there's no question that therapeutic culture is part of it, but I think the bigger part of it is the social media allowed the critical race, gender queer theory, feminist type ideas to leave the campus and enter the youth culture, the pop culture, corporations in a way that they had entered to some degree, but not to the same extent in the past. The newspapers, the New York Times, none of these papers were parroting these ideas in the 90s. In fact, they were quite opposed to them. And so I think the big shift is the scaling and moving off campus, which then means it's getting into the schools, into the youth culture, so the young people are getting it more.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned the harm care morality that has become so faddish in these circles. There was this row at the New York Times when the science reporter, I think Don McNeil, was pushed out, and a group of 150 Times staffers wrote the publisher of the New York Times saying that you trained us that it's the harm that matters, not the intent. And it was really that intervention by these 150 staffers that got McNeil fired even after he was initially let off the hook from an investigation. So you can see this is not just in the university anymore. And part of what I'm wondering and what I'm struck by is, even if we fix the university, which I hope we will do, will we actually fix the culture, or has this sort of jumped the lab in a way that it's no longer even fixable by reforming the university?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's really left the Wuhan lab, I think.
Right.
Now, I don't think,
it's in the wet market right now.
Yeah, but I mean, fixing the university, well, that just seems, that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. But yeah, you're right. It's off campus in a way it wasn't as much in the 90s. God, what do you even do? I mean, I think, one of the things you notice in the data, for example, is that in terms of indoctrination, it's the schools now. I don't think a lot of the studies of universities don't show much effect. By the time they step on campus, they are already believers in all of these ideas. So I don't think the universities are actually doing much indoctrinating, but I think it's the schools, which is really has to be the target really for a lot of effort. Beyond that, of course, just trying to sort of push back on this idea that extreme egalitarianism and extreme emotional harm protection are the most important values in society. And that is really what we're saying, as focused on these identity groups. And how do you begin to sort of shift that? I think you've got to get at it with the education system. You've obviously got to get it in the battle of ideas, but I think if the education system is controlled by these ideas, then we're already at a big disadvantage. I mean, one of the reasons I very much support, for example, critical race theory bans in school, not in universities, but in school, an attempt to mold the curriculum in public schools. I don't believe school choice can do much, honestly, for a whole bunch of reasons. But you have to begin to push for neutrality and remove indoctrination from the school system. And only then can we then have more of an even playing field for this battle of ideas. But without that, it's going to be difficult.
Would you oppose, let's say, a social studies teacher in 11th or 12th grade American classroom saying, okay, you're going to read Ibrahim X. Kendi, but you're going to also read John McWhorter, and have them,
that's the ideal. Yeah. I mean, that would be the ideal, right? And if they did that, then hey, great. Here's my worry. My worry is that given what we know and given the kinds of people that are going to be attracted to teaching that, the likelihood you're going to get a fair hearing for both of those sides is pretty low. And that's my concern. And that's the reason why, practically speaking, even though it's against, to some degree, the spirit of free speech and inquiry, I mean, we would love it to have both sides and they can make their own minds up. But unless you're able to ensure that both sides are being taught with, fairly, then I think, unfortunately, the only alternative to that is to say, sorry, we don't want you teaching this. And the reason for that is I just think practically having a ban is simply more likely to sort of engineer this sort of neutral classroom than hoping that you're going to get some kind of balance.
That's interesting because I'm hoping to pivot this podcast at some point to K through 12 education, and I'm going to really want to go deep there. Maybe I'll have you back on in that segment as well. So let's spend some time on what it would take to do this very tall task in that to reform the university. There have been various ideas out there. One of the things that I've talked to people are this sort of emerging model of the civic for thought, the civic thought centers. We're seeing them in several universities around the United States, where where a new center emerges that really does abide by the principles of classical liberalism and true academic freedom, and it recruits professors who believe in those values and probably attracts students who believe in those values. And the idea is that over time, that model might even overtake the grievance studies programs and the other places, because that's where you're going to have the most serious talent, and maybe will restore some of the sanity to the university. Have you heard about those? And if so, what do you think about them?
Yeah, very much. I mean, I think they're some of the most exciting developments in higher education. I think you're absolutely right. Those are important. And I'll tell you a couple of things. I mean, I mentioned that there are two threats really to academic freedom. One comes from your institution firing you or threatening to fire you. Now, that can be dealt with legislatively. Britain's legislation really will fine universities for breaches. They'll allow people to sue. There's all kinds of things I think you can do to prevent at least publicly funded institutions from enforcing speech codes and firing people and canceling. So that's one thing that has to happen, I think, across all U.S. states. I think it should happen across all U.S. states, whether it will or not. And it's not enough just to say you have to have a Chicago Principles statement on free speech. There has to be, I think, proactive monitoring by a office. In this case, we have sort of a free speech czar in the UK. It's sort of a free speech director in the Office for Students, which regulates the university sector. So they'll have a staff of 5 or 10 that can pursue universities, investigate, issue guidance on what your statements are allowed to and not allowed to say around university reputation, harassment, and all these things. And that's you need that proactive process. Otherwise, universities will put up a statement and just ignore it. That's what's happened in Canada, by the way. A couple of provinces have these laws. They throw up their statement and completely ignore it. You need to actually have enforcement with teeth. That's one thing. But then in terms of, that's not going to deal with the peer pressure problem of political discrimination, not hiring those who aren't conforming. And that's why these centers are so important, because if you look at the data, and whether that's students or staff, the more of a monoculture politically you have, the more self-censorship you have. And it's almost a one-to-one relationship. So you take the student body in the U.S., according to the FIRE surveys, it's about, 50% liberal, 20% conservative. It's roughly that, 2.5 to 1. And if you actually look at there are a few universities where conservatives and liberals are about equal, and maybe it's the University of Utah or a couple of others, Brigham Young, maybe Mississippi State. There's a few of them. Those are the places where you've got the lowest level of self-censorship, actually. People on the left self-censor a little more, but conservatives self-censor, 40 points less than in much of the system. You have to have a critical mass of conservative people in there for this thing to work. And the optimum it's got to be almost 10 points more conservative than liberal, because that sort of overcompensates for the general drift of the culture. Now, that's in the ideal. We're not going to get that. But I would say, yes, trying to create these centers where it is explicitly the case that they are going to have more of a balance, I think is vital. And so, and actually at the university in Britain, I'm at the University of Buckingham now, which is the only one out of 181 British universities that is at least attempting to be, neutral and to prioritize free speech over emotional safety and social justice. And that's vital. You have to have these centers. Now, the retort to that, I think, is just to say, well, these are small. They're just a few specks on, 4,000 institutions. What is a few people going to matter? And I think there's truth to that, I'm afraid. But I do think that if they are influential, research-wise in particular, then they can have an impact. Because most academic papers are never cited, or if they are cited, it's like a couple of people have read it.
Let me put the question in a provocative way. Do you support viewpoint affirmative action?
So it's funny because Heterodox Academy is having me on to discuss this very thing. But here's my view. My view is that essentially, kind of yes, in a way, or at least what I would say is setting up these centers. You could say, well, that's a kind of form of affirmative action in pursuit of a kind of diversity of thought. And I suppose my view would be, well, yes, I think that's probably a positive thing. Now, I'm also in favor of what I would call something called equivalent action, which would be, anything you're doing to promote race, sex, gender diversity, you must do exactly the same on ideological diversity, right? Now, if you want to dial down your race, gender, DEI to zero, you don't even monitor, then that's fine. But if you're going to monitor race and gender, you got to monitor ideology. And if you're going to report on one, you got to report on the other. I think that would be bring a good discipline to universities. So they would have to be consistent, in terms of, are you going to be, completely colorblind in a way, or are you going to actually engage in affirmative action? My view on affirmative action, by the way, is a bit different from some others. My view is that, if you do affirmative action, and we see this a bit on class or income, where actually some of these poorer students from less well-off backgrounds come into, say, Oxford and Cambridge, and they do really well. In fact, I think they even do better than the private school kids. I could be wrong on that. But that affirmative action, I wouldn't be opposed to, because it shows that actually there was a genuine inequality of opportunity. So you can maybe make the case that, okay, it's actually rectifying something real. I think similarly in this case, when you're bringing in people who are not represented in the academy because they're on the right, I think that you are going to see likewise, high quality research, high quality teaching, and an improvement of discussions. So again, I think the case is there for affirmative action much more than it would be, say, on race or in some cases gender, where in fact the outcome isn't particularly good and you're not getting anything. Now, it's not to say that I believe in equal treatment and non-discrimination, but I think if you are going to make the case for taking into account to some degree people's social backgrounds, and I think in the case of ideology, it's a very strong case.
So, there's a lot of talk about DEI, particularly after the December 5th hearings of those 3 university presidents, and all of a sudden a term that I think very few people had really heard of. They may have known the idea of diversity training, but DEI now has become a real topic of conversation. There are different schools of thought, of course, even among people who are highly critical of it. There are people who are arguing that we have to just flat out ban it and there are people who are arguing that, listen, we're not going to be able to ban it. So let's try to reform it. Let's try to incorporate viewpoint diversity, as you were suggesting, as sort of a primary form of diversity, which would then neutralize some of the more ideologically problematic aspects of DEI. There are people, like I've even argued, well, maybe you try to oppose, you support the bans in red states and you try to reform it in blue states. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I would say that in theory you could, in theory, right? You could imagine a situation where you would say, okay, we're not recruiting anybody from the Deep South, or and so why is that? Maybe we want some of those people, and so, but without compromising standards, we're just going to make more efforts on recruitment, and so that we get more of a diverse pipeline. I think that's all legitimate, or it's even legitimate if you have 2 people who are really exactly the same in terms of their SAT scores or some other metrics, and just you're going to give the nod to somebody on the basis that yes, okay, we can pursue a diversity aim once we have satisfied ourselves that they're exactly the same in every other way. I think that's fine. It's a bit like this debate over critical race theory in schools. Can you trust the administrators that are there now to undertake this policy in a fair-minded way? And I'm afraid you can't, because their ideology is very much, no, we've got to mirror proportionally the population on race. They don't care about any, and maybe gender if we're talking about engineering or science subjects. That's what they care about. And so the problem is that you can't trust them. And it's the same situation. Yes, I'd love to have McWhorter versus Kendi in the school classroom. Can I trust the education establishment to do that? No. And that's the problem, is without the trust, we can't have the optimal solution. So we have to go for the least worst solution, which may just be scrapping DEI altogether. It's not, or you could say perhaps, I don't know, maybe the idea is you got to cut down the numbers of staff, and you've got to do it in such a way that doesn't violate equal treatment. Maybe that's the way you do it, is you say, well, if it's tiebreaker stuff, if it's not violating equal treatment, so you're just trying to enrich your pipeline, then yeah, go to it. But the other problem is in the diversity training, where it's this majority-minority paradigm. White male is the baddie, even though we know, for example, that certainly when it comes to hate crime, minority on minority is a proportionally bigger source of hate crime than white on minority. Everybody's discriminating against everybody. Let's make it equal opportunity, right? If we're going to have diversity training, so in theory you could have it. In practice, can we trust the existing staff to enact a fairer DEI? I'm skeptical.
So let me last question. It's really about academic freedom. The concept of academic freedom is usually applied to professors. If you're allowed to say what you want, with I guess some limitations, but without fear of reprisals from the university. And yet students, very often, many classrooms can't really say what they want. You can see in a grievance studies program, it would be almost impossible for a student who doesn't share the professor's view to pipe in and say, I'm sorry, I disagree fundamentally with your anti-racism philosophy. And I think it's wrong. And I think you're misciting police statistics or something like that. I think they'd be completely persecuted by the professor and their fellow students who would side with the professor. And yet it seems to me that is, if maybe I'm taking the concept of academic freedom too literally. Maybe it's something much more circumscribed than that. It really is just to apply to the academic world. But I'm still struck by the problem, and wondering if there are things that you think we could do. Maybe auditing classes where you're not looking out for professors who sort of say controversial or radical things, but rather are ensuring that they're teaching people multiple perspectives. Do you think there's anything we can do about that?
Well, I think there actually is. If you can have these student surveys that ask people whether they self-censor in class or are politically discriminated against in class. So that you could do, and if you were able to get the students politics or ideology, you could see if the political minorities are being discriminated against or feel that they can't speak. So universities could do that. Perhaps it's could be done legislatively as well and required. That would then show up where the problems are. The other thing I think is there is almost no mention. It's perfectly. I've been in hiring committees and in job talks where people openly make disparaging comments about people's politics. That should not be permitted. I think that, you should have to, well, it depends. Obviously people should have their free speech. However, the norm should be political neutrality, and there should be anti-discrimination on the grounds of politics in job hiring, in anything. And also I think the universities need to be politically neutral. That is, anyone in an official capacity should not be taking a view on a contested political issue. That's kind of also part of the Calvin report in the University of Chicago. So I think this combination of adopting the Calvin report principles of institutional neutrality coupled with a stronger anti-political discrimination norm, coupled with monitoring through surveys, I think can help it'll help a certain amount. Now, am I naive enough to think this is going to make the entire difference? No. I mean, University of Chicago has excellent policies, and it's still got high self-censorship because of the ideological makeup of the faculty and student body. And so I think the problem is this peer effect, and it's not quite clear how you get around that for students. For staff, we can create these centers where there is more of a balance and they feel safer to speak. But for students, I don't know is the answer. I mean, obviously there are some universities like University of Austin where they're trying to create that more politically mixed situation. And that may be the only way that that can work until we get a change of attitude. Because don't forget, this all stems from attitude shifts amongst young people, which we've been tracking in the survey data. Young people today are just a lot more morally absolutist and intolerant than young people were even in 2000.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I watched it happen when I was heading a campus-oriented organization. Yeah, it's one of the other things I've heard, Greg Lukianoff from FIRE shared, it said that at Dartmouth, there's a conservative and a liberal professor teaching classes together in several centers or departments. And that seems to me, if you did that enough, you could affect a cultural shift among the students. But I don't know, maybe it runs deeper than that. Maybe they would just take the class and continue the same peer pressure that they did before.
Well, I think that'd be a tremendous idea, by the way. I think also adversarial collaborations and research where you have people with different political views. Now, it's going to be very difficult in a Dartmouth to get a conservative professor or to get more than one or two of them. So, that
will force them to scale up. And you say, we need them to teach our classes. Right.
Or there'll be one person doing all the teaching.
Right.
So then there's going to be no conservative research. But, But yeah, I think those are all good ideas. But I think the problem is really coming out of the school system now. And, there I think just really, at least in red states, they can push for political neutrality and try to get the ideology out of the schools. I think that has to be kind of job one. Now, they should also be teaching about the law, the First Amendment. Studies show that students who've been taught First Amendment are much more pro-free speech. That should be happening. We should be getting a more balanced view of history, if excesses of the left as well as of the right. All of those things have to happen at K-12 level. I think by the time people set foot on campus, it's almost game over.
My organization, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, is actually much more engaged in the K-12 arena than we are in the university arena, because there's a glut of organizations now involved in that side. Eric, I really appreciate your take on this. I really appreciate all the research that you've done over many years that's helped expose the problem, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks, David. Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure, and keep up your excellent work.
Thank you for tuning in to The Contrarian. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to rate our podcast on Apple and Spotify. Stay connected with us on social media for more updates. Until next time, keep challenging.